All right, welcome class. So previously we had discussed the making offers and how to keep a conversation going. Now we're in the last phase, which is how to close a conversation. Now, what we call this is departure rituals. Remember, we're kind of drawing on a ritual framework for making sense of a lot of what we do in social interaction. Now, when we think of rituals, we tend to think of things like ceremonies and rituals. And like we discussed before, the beginning of a conversation often has ritualistic feels to it, right? Like you have some kind of dramatic beginning, in which case it might be the, hey, how are you, shaking your hand, making eye contact, smiling, having that first embrace. And ceremonies in general, rituals in general, typically have a dramatic end of some kind, just as they have a dramatic beginning of some kind. Let's look at some examples. So think of graduation ceremonies. So when you graduate someday, there's going to be a dramatic beginning where you probably all walk in and everyone kind of stands up and, you sit in your seat. Then you go through the graduation. But once you get your diploma, it's not just, okay, everyone leave. There's a dramatic ending where you walk out of the ceremony and then everyone stands up again and you have the dramatic close, if you will. Think of weddings, right? Weddings, there's the whole entry of the groomsmen and then the bride walks down, and that's kind of like, I don't know if that's the climax of the wedding, I guess the kiss is, I don't know. But either way, the bride coming down the aisle is a big deal, so that's the dramatic entrance. And then, of course, once you kiss the bride, it's not over. Now you have to have the dramatic exit, where everyone leaves together and, lives happily ever after, at least in theory. So there's all kinds of rituals where there's a dramatic beginning and there's also a dramatic ending of some kind. Now, what we call in conversation then is we call them departures, the process of ending an interaction. So, you can just put the process of ending an interaction. Okay. Then you can put interaction like that. Okay. So, just like I've said before, where we're kind of like the social world is secularly religious, okay? So it's religious, but it's about the ego or the person, right? So that's the ultimate. So when we're talking to people, we're still paying respects to them when we depart, right? Because remember, when we're having a conversation with someone, it's not like, oh, hey, Chris, how you doing? Oh, I'm good. I just went to a baseball game. Bye. If you did that, the person would think you said the wrong answer or that, something went wrong. Usually it's, oh, Chris, how's the baseball game? Oh, it's good. I did this. Oh, okay, that's cool. That's cool. Well, hey, it was really good talking to you, and I hope you continue to have fun at baseball games, blah, blah. See, there's this little thing that you play where you kind of have to, warm them up to the fact that you're leaving and then you go. Now, sometimes, and we'll talk about this, you don't have time to do all that. And then there's where some complexities can come into play. But typically, with all things being equal, right, we typically depart through a process, not through an instantaneous type deal. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, here's the thing about departure rituals. Relationships can end badly, but they never begin badly, okay? If a relationship begins badly, it usually never takes off. But you can have a wonderful greeting and all that stuff, but then something happens to where you have a falling out with someone, right? That's what we call it. We call it a falling out. We had a falling out, right? And that's where there wasn't really a formal, respectful departure between the two of you. And so that's something that's interesting to keep in mind as we talk about this. Now, here are the conversations typically end. And I don't typically, or I don't expect this to be a complete list. This is something I'm still thinking through and working on, so I'm kind of sharing a beta version of departures. So I'm very interested in what you have to say and what you have to add to this as we go through it. So typical closures or departures, the first are lulls. Okay, so lulls are moments of silence in a conversation. So whenever you're trying to make a conversation with someone and it's not going somewhere, like it's not going anywhere, and so you have those awkward silences, that's what I call a lull, okay? Now, a conversation might just end because of lulls. So you're talking and then you just kind of run out of steam, if you will. So there's that moment of silence and then you're just kind of like, well, gotta go, that kind of thing. So that's a lull. An excuse is where you have some kind of task that you need to attend to. Now, the task can be something related to the environment. It can be something that's very mundane, or just having to go to the bathroom even. So an excuse would be in the middle of the conversation, well, look, I got to get back to what I'm doing here, but it was great talking to you, blah, 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 got to go. Or, oh, I got to go check on my kids, got to go. Okay, bye. So excuses, having to go back to whatever the task that you were doing prior to the conversation or that you need to do after the conversation is a type of closure or a typical departure. So I should have put departure here because then I'm about to use it again. So typical departures, if you will. Okay. Proofread. Okay. Closure. So closure is where you restate the purpose you restate the purpose of why the interaction first took place, and you bring closure to that. So if you start the conversation with something like, "Hey, I was just coming to check in and see how you're doing," and you go in and you're like, "Oh yeah, I'm doing pretty well," blah blah blah. How you might end the conversation is, okay, well, I just wanted to check in. 5 minutes later, you might say, okay, I just wanted to check in with you and just see how you're doing. So it sounds like you're doing pretty good, so I'm glad to hear that, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So closure is where the task is complete. Okay? So you've completed the task that you said that you were going to aim. And so that's it. And then you have interruptions. So this is kind of outside of your control, and it's not really ritual because it's an interruption, but it's where somebody from the outside joins the conversation and takes it another direction, or if the professor starts talking or something in the environment happens to where you can no longer converse. Okay, that's an interruption. Now, if it's somebody joining the conversation, okay, so like let's say you're at a networking event and somebody, like you're talking to somebody and you're having a good conversation, and then this third person just comes out of nowhere and starts talking. Technically, there are ways that properly enter the conversation. Typically, they should let you finish talking and ask, like, what were you guys talking about before they change the topic. But sometimes people don't do that, so then it makes you mad because it's like, hey, we were talking about something important. Now you come in talking about your cats. Hey, I wanted to finish my conversation with this person about that. So there are ritual ways of entry for those. And that gets a little bit more complicated, and we might cover that in group communication. Now, here's the thing. These are all very oral, okay? So these are very explicit ways that we close conversations is through these lulls, excuses, closure, and then interruptions if it's, in our control or not. But what often happens, and this is much of our social lives, and unfortunately we don't have time to go into this in a lot of depth. You probably need to take an interpersonal communication class if you want to even touch this, maybe even a nonverbal class, really. But the way we really get by in social life first, I think primarily, is through cues, okay? And a transition signal is a kind of cue. Okay, so a transition signal is any kind of cue that indicates you want to leave or need to leave the conversation. Okay, so cues are any kind of, so let me put this up here. Cues are any kind of nonverbal act that indicates what we want done. Okay, so like, let's take the example of transition signal. So when you're having coffee with a friend, okay, and it's been an hour, all right, and you want to leave, but your friend wants to keep talking. There are certain cues that we give that it's like time to go, okay? And we can kind of think of some of the cues that we might give. We might take our keys out, right? So we haven't said anything, but we just got our keys out and we've made the jingling noise, okay? So that should indicate to your friend, if they're in any way socially aware, that should indicate to them that you're wanting to leave, or like that it's almost time to go. The thing I do, I put the napkin on the table if it's like lunch or dinner, because like the napkin kind of on the table kind of indicates finality. And if my partner is paying attention, then he or she should be able to catch the cue, if you will. When I'm teaching class, I'll have students like, in the last 2 minutes of class, they'll start putting their stuff away. So that's kind of my cue, like, okay, they got to get ready to go. Now, they haven't said anything. They didn't say anything oral like, oh, it's time to go. They just gave me a cue. They just did something to kind of indicate to me that this is what's going on. And a lot of the social world is this, or actually it's this, cues. This is much of life, okay? Cues, reading, cues, okay? And of course, like when you start talking about like friendships, business relationships, romantic relationships, there's all these things about cues. And if you watch Seinfeld at all, there's all kinds of crazy things that can come up and ridiculous things that come up because you didn't know if you were reading the cues right. But we prefer things to be implicit first. And if it doesn't work implicitly, then we tend to get explicit. We're rarely explicit first. We tend to try to do the implicit and hope people get the hint, and then go from there. But sometimes we're not successful because we don't give off enough cues or because the person can't pick them up well enough. Now, not everyone has the right to end a conversation. So this is something to keep in mind as you try to get out of conversations that you no longer want to be in, okay? For example, like when somebody takes you out to dinner, okay, and they say, I'm buying you dinner tonight, okay, right after you eat, like let's say like the minute the waiter takes the plate, you can, but it would be kind of rude, right? If you said, oh, well, I just ate, gotta go, nice talking to you, right? Typically the thing that we do when somebody takes us out to dinner is, oh, after the waiter takes our food, we stay and we talk to them for a while, right? Because technically they're the ones taking us out, so they're technically the ones who declare when we leave and when we don't leave, right? We technically don't leave before them. We leave with them or after them. Think about when you're in a meeting with a boss or a superior. So the boss calls you in and says, hey, I need to talk to you about something. You technically can't leave when you want, right? You can't end the conversation when you want. You typically, if the boss says, I'm here, I need to talk to you about your annual performance. And then they'll well, I got to go. Well, no, I haven't dismissed you yet, right? That's typically how the boss would say it. And so you can't leave then. So you have to wait for the boss to give you the cue that it's time to leave. You see? So there might be other examples where you'll think about this and maybe you'll come up with in your blogs in terms of times when you think when you don't have control about leaving. So think of some other examples. That'd be good, something to write about. Now, ways to end a conversation. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these 5 different ways conversations end. And this will be useful for you whenever you're caught in a conversation with someone and you kind of want to get out, but you want to get out gracefully, okay? Because even when I ask my students in my face-to-face class, a lot of them have friends who, like, just won't stop talking, okay? They just don't know when to, like, I don't want to say shut up, but, like, just to, like, okay, it's time to move on. Okay, you've had an hour now, that kind of thing. Okay, so the first thing is you can use a transition signal. Very easily, create a nonverbal or two that shows you want to leave. Sometimes people, like if you're a really good listener, people will just want to keep talking because like, oh wow, somebody's really listening to me, blah, blah, blah. So, but if you can put out a transition signal, so if it's at lunch with the keys, if it's face-to-face, maybe start looking around the room. If it's like at a social function of some kind, if it's give some kind of nonverbal cues and give them 2 or 3 if they're not catching the first one. That's just like, okay, I think we're at a transition now, it's time to go, okay? Lulls. Force the lulls. So when it's your turn to talk, don't add anything. Just create a lull, and then don't do the stare nod either, okay, from the previous lecture. Just create that lull, and then, once you hit like 2 or 3 seconds, then you can say, well, it's time to go. Look at your watch, do what you got to do, and then use an excuse to get out of the conversation. But create a lull. Force the lull. Excuses. So manufacture any kind of excuse that you can come up with, okay? Now, it doesn't have to be anything important, okay? So just think like if you were doing something and somebody comes up to you and starts talking and you just don't want to talk anymore, whatever the next thing you were trying to do, just say you got to get back to that thing. For the most part, people don't question your excuses. So if you say, well, I got to get back to studying now, nobody's going to go, well, what are you studying for? Why do you have to study? And you're like, well, I have a class, I got a test. Well, why do you study for a test? What are you in school for? Like, nobody really goes that deep. So it doesn't have to be anything earth-shattering. It can just be, I need to get back to what I'm doing, even. It can be vague. It doesn't have to even be specific. But when you give that excuse, that'll help. Then closure. And if you started the conversation, then it's easy for you to do this. If you were just checking in on somebody and then they're going on, and you got to move on to your next thing, you can just bring back the purpose. Well, I was just coming in to check in with you, blah, 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 glad you're doing well. If they came up to you, okay, so they came with the purpose, you just recall the purpose, or you summarize the purpose why they came. So let's say you're at the library and somebody from class comes up to you and starts talking, okay? And they were just kind of walking by saying hello. In the middle of the conversation, you can say, well, I appreciate you coming by and saying hello and noticing me. That's cool. But I got to get back to the studying. Okay, so you provided closure. Thanks for checking up on me. Okay, now I need to get back to what I'm doing. And then lastly, interruption. So you can manufacture an interruption, and you got to just treat it like the shiny object in the room. So you establish a shiny object in the room, and you go there. Okay? So, you might start looking around and say, oh, I see one of my other friends. I need to go and say hi to them. You can find something in the room or in the environment where you say, oh, I'm drawn to that thing. I need to go attend to that thing. Girls, for example, when they go out to bars, they usually go in groups, and they're very good at interruptions, right? Because they'll go in groups, and then when somebody's talking to them and they don't want to talk to that guy anymore or that person anymore, they give each other the signal, the eye contact, and their friend comes, pulls them out. And that's manufacturing an interruption, essentially. And then they don't have to worry about saying goodbye or having to do anything like that because the friend saves them. So that's another very intelligent way to end a conversation as well. But either way, the key to a good departure is to end with appreciation. We want to show appreciation for the person's time, for them taking the energy to talk to us, and always wish them the best, because the key to building goodwill with others is expressing it. So that's the basics on departure rituals. I'm very interested in what you have to add and what you have to say, because this is stuff that's I'm still building on and still thinking about. So, but this is what I have for you so far. So if you have any other questions, let me know, and I look forward to your blog responses.